A minister I know likes to dress up once a year as an historical figure and give the sermon as if he were that person. Persons like Albert Schweitzer or Mark Twain. One year he dressed up as the Abrahamic God. He had a long white beard and was pushed in a wheelchair. His point in the sermon was that the current monotheistic God might be dying in the collective human understanding. And that was fine, he said. Gods come and gods go. But then he challenged us to think about how we would wrestle now with the big questions of being human without this God to frame our answers. And he reminded us that celebrity culture wasn't going to cut it. This sermon from long ago surfaced in my mind as I sat listening to a lecture given by William Cavanaugh, a professor of Catholic studies at DePaul University. Cavanaugh's lecture was on idolatry, which perhaps surprisingly is a concept Unitarian Universalists can readily dig into. It comes up, for example, in an earlier articulation of our wisdom sources, specifically our humanist source. Humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. My dictionary defines idolatry as the worship of idols or a blind or excessive devotion to something. A blind or excessive devotion. An idol is defined as an image used as an object of worship or a false god. Various flags might come to mind. That long ago minister touched on the idolatry of celebrity. Celebrity culture may have reached its apex in our country. It has been observed that the presidency is now seen as an entry-level job into politics for the notorious. Cabinet positions too, it turns out. Professor Cavanaugh touched on the idolatry of nationalism, another popular idolatry in our society, but he spent most of his time talking about the idolatry of consumer capitalism. Cavanaugh began with the German sociologist Max Weber, who died in 1920. Weber uses the word Entzauberung, which can literally mean unmagicking, but which was translated into English as disenchantment. Weber reflects on the disenchantment of the world. The philosopher Charles Taylor ran with this notion and wrote, "Everyone can agree that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in an enchanted world, and we do not. Our ancestors lived in a world inhabited by gods and demons, ghosts and angels, wood sprites and saints. The boundaries between the material and the spiritual were permeable, and the immanent world made frequent contact with the transcendent." Cavanaugh, in an article which his lecture says, "Today we live in a disenchanted world, devoid of divine or demonic spirits, devoid of mystery, a world with no ordered meaning," or so the story goes. He continues, "In Weber's view, disenchantment was the end result of a long process of rationalization, of which science and capitalism were the principal drivers. Weber was himself a rationalist who described himself as unmusical with regard to religion. But he did not simply celebrate the process of rationalization and disenchantment. He thought that the technical advances of modernity came at a price, and he feared that modern people would become specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. In Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he ends with a melancholy description of the iron cage of modernity, a heartlessly efficient machine from which all enchantment has been ruthlessly eliminated, for better and for worse. Cavanaugh, however, was making the point in his lecture that we do not, in fact, live in a disenchanted world. Instead, we've simply shifted the locus of our enchantment, and he uses the company Amazon to describe this. First, he talks about what's like for workers in Amazon's fulfillment centers. The goal is to turn them into efficient machines. Their actions are electronically monitored, and they have a pick rate that they must meet or be fired. Amazon has been developing a wristband that would monitor employee activity to free them from having to type into or hold a scanner. And then their every move could be recorded in service to increasing their efficiency. It is said that some employees urinate into bottles rather than lose time going to the restroom. They're often not accorded benefits and are fired for too many sick days. I imagine Amazon employees could tell you all you needed to know about the iron cage of modernity. This is certainly not the enchanted world, but a rational one that seeks to automate human beings for the benefit of somebody's bottom line. The flip side, the enchantment, comes into play for consumers. If you have access to money or credit, you can spend hours looking at an endless amount of material goods on Amazon's website. With the click of a button, you can summon any of these goods and they will magically appear on your doorstep. Kavanaugh writes, the entire production process, the sourcing of raw materials, the manufacturing and transportation, the packing and delivering is invisible to the consumer, as are the people involved in this process. All we see are images of the shiny, finished products on a screen, and then the products themselves on our doorsteps. So it seems that there are two sides to our economy, a rationalized, disenchanted side typified by heartless efficiency, and an enchanted side, still filled with charged objects and magic. I think the pandemic made the rationalized part of the equation more apparent. It was brought to our attention in those early days that Amazon workers were worried about contacting the virus, which forced us to acknowledge there are people in this process. Our meat doesn't magically appear. There are workers involved, as we learned when COVID first swept through the meatpacking plants. All the products that appear on our doorsteps or on store shelves have human workers behind them. Who knew? Well, we all did. We just didn't have to think about it. And you notice that we are not talking about these workers much anymore, allowing them to fade from our awareness once again. In his lecture, Kavanaugh continued to build his case by talking about the evolution of advertising. At some point in our history, people made or grew or gathered most of what they needed. As mass production got underway, they had to be convinced they needed, or at least wanted, more things. Cue advertising. At first, ads described something like a shoe and tried to convince you this was the shoe for you by enumerating its many fine qualities. Later, advertising began to be linked to more abstract things. Buy this shoe and people will find you sexually attractive. Later still, ads were only about a brand. No product was even in sight. Nike, just do it. Consumption is no longer about meeting basic needs, but about satisfying our need for meaning and transcendence. We are being sold enchantment. Kavanaugh takes these ideas a little further, talking about how capitalism becomes its own thing, divorced from humanity. He writes, and as commodities take on life, life is drained away from actual people. Hungry people don't count in the market unless they have money, and workers are regarded as labor costs, which need to be minimized. Commodification also hides the conditions of work. All the consumer sees in the store or on Amazon's website is the commodity and its price. It takes a Herculean effort to uncover the people who actually made the product and delivered it, and the conditions in which they worked. Kavanaugh uses the example of people going hungry while farmers destroy crops or dump milk because they have no value as a commodity. It has been my observation that profit trumps every other consideration. When something is proposed that could be profitable, concerns for the environment or the safety and health of human beings and non-human life are considered emotional or naive or basically irrelevant. We cannot stand in the way of progress, at least progress as capitalism defines it. If there's money to be made, it must be made. This idolatry spreads insidiously. It seems to be easing now, but for a good chunk of time, libraries, schools, churches, basically every endeavor was encouraged to fit itself into a business model with smart goals and metrics to measure outcomes. It was thought that a business model would improve every aspect of our lives. Remember a few elections ago how much we heard about needing a businessman to run the government? The thought that relational entities could have a value separate from capitalism was rejected. Many ministers also complained about how consumerism had infiltrated the church in that new generation. It was so steeped in capitalism, they saw church as a commodity for consumption. They paid for it in the form of pledging, and now they were entitled to a polished show. The idea of building relationship and reciprocity was not a part of the package. If they were not getting enough value for their dollar, they went shopping for a new faith community. So by now, you may be feeling a little smug. You personally have not been sucked into the idolatry of celebrity, nationalism, or consumer capitalism, or not too much, or at least not as much as those people over there. But I'm willing to bet that all of us engage in idolatry. I remember an English professor of mine saying that he had been to a production of Dr. Faustus and would never go near it again, as it was so terrifying, being about intellectual pride and all. It was too close to home for him. I was telling a friend I wanted to just read Kavanaugh's article to you, that it was so beautifully written and made the point so eloquently. I just wanted to deliver it as is. I often struggle in sermons not to include long, long quotes when something is well written. She suggested that might be a form of idolatry, the worship of the written word. Ouch. What makes idolatry so prevalent and seductive? Well, several answers come to mind. The first is our need for certainty. We want to be able to depend on some things. You might be longing for some certainty right about now in the midst of all this national chaos. I would say that idolatry is also born, like many things, out of our existential loneliness. That deep, if unexamined, knowing that we are essentially alone in the universe and there is no ultimate meaning for our existence. Existential loneliness is a cruel driver that makes us dance in strange ways. We seek, perhaps very unconsciously, to dispel that loneliness, and if we can't find meaning and connection, at least we can find distraction. Early in the pandemic, my mother was expressing her concern we would go right back to excessive consumption once the pandemic was over, having learned nothing. While she talked, I could only think about the little hit of endorphins I get if there's a package in the mail for me. We seek these little hits in all the wrong places: gambling, alcohol, fentanyl, social media, retail therapy, adrenaline rushes, junk food, and so on. For a minute, we feel good and we're distracted from our terrible isolation. Kavanaugh, of course, saw the antidote to idolatry and distraction as a turn back toward God, a return to worshiping the one true God. Most Unitarian Universalists will not have that option. I think for us, the antidote to idolatry and distraction is to turn and face the beast of existential loneliness, to do the work to wrestle with the beast and find our own meaning, purpose, and sustaining relationships. Someone recently wondered out loud what the benefit of a spiritual practice is. I would say spiritual practice is an intentional choice to deliberately turn away from idolatries and distractions and to engage in a focused way with what it means to be human, to engage with the big questions, to decide how to show up in your life, and then to remind yourself who you want to be and how you want to live. Often enough, you will actually live into your best self once in a while. Perhaps idolatry simply tells us when we have become stuck along the way, or we turn to idolatry when fear or a need for comfort or a lack of imagination has suppressed our curiosity, our ability to grow. When we are too tired or defeated to think bigger and fall into the comfort of blind or excessive devotion to something. I imagine we've all done this at least once in our own theologies and our own justice views. It is said we all have excessive devotion, even to facts, trusting the first thing we learned and very resistant to updating what we know. Where are you stuck? Where are you resisting curiosity? How are you distracting yourself? What is getting excessive devotion from you? In short, what are you idolizing? Is it time to move on? I would invite you to notice the idolatry happening in this country and in your own mind over the coming weeks. The novelist David Foster Wallace said, "Because here's something else that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some inviolable set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. We are bombarded in the news with men who never have enough, worshiping money and power as they do. Can people tell by looking at your life what you worship? When I wrote that question, immediately many of your faces came to mind. I thought of all the ways you show up in the world for your families, for one another, for the wider community. If we all give in to idolatry from time to time, it is equally true that what you worship guides your actions in a myriad of beautiful, life-affirming, and loving ways. So I would encourage you all to continue to worship some spiritual type thing, to not be eaten alive by idolatry, and to keep the truth of what you worship up front in daily consciousness. Be who you aim to be.